Dc28, Keepers of the Silence. Soul-touching and life-enhancing stories. Keepers of the Silence. Long, long ago in the country of Japan, there was a small and simple village. This village had something very special, for in the middle of the village was standing a steep rock plateau. From a distance, the village looked like the rim of a hat, and the rock plateau like the hat itself. On top of this rock plateau was lots of vegetation, gardens and flowers, and in the middle of this rock plateau was a huge round monastery. It was built with huge stones, grey and brown ones, and everywhere in between those huge stones were small windows. The way to reach up to this plateau, which was as high as an 8-story building, were stone steps set in the mountain wall. And there were 4 of them, one in the north, one in the south, the east, and the west. As it was a monastery, of course, there were monks living there, but not only monks, but also nuns. Like a cake sliced in half, one side of the monastery was for the nuns and the other for the monks. There were permanent monks and nuns staying here, and then there were also boys and girls. From every family in the village, when a child, boy or girl, had reached a certain age, they would go to the monastery for 2 years and learn the secret of silence. As the monastery was self-sufficient, for it had its own wells and was a great place to learn about gardening, herbs, harvesting fruits and seeds, and then there were other trades to be learned and experienced, such as weaving, the making of clothing, the art of healing, and martial arts. Each permanent nun or monk had their task to keep life going on the plateau, and to share their knowledge with the boys and girls. Some children, by their own choice, at a later stage became monks and nuns themselves, and others went back living in society. The monastery played a very important role in the life of the villagers. There was a huge bell, which rang once a day, and at that moment all the people in the village, including those on the plateau, put down their tools, stopped their work, and put aside all their thoughts, and stayed some moments in silence, in order to thank the life-giver for the gift of life. After the bell had rung, from the 4 sides of the rock plateau, the nuns and monks came down the stone steps and entered the village, and shared food with the villagers, which was carried down in baskets. As the monks and nuns came down into the village, it looked like a special procession, with a special purpose, not only to bring food, but they walked through the village to bring peace. Each monk or nun had a huge straw hat, their faces were painted white, and they wore huge kimonos in the color of white and khaki. There were no shoes, and some carried small gongs or small belts, or play a flute, and those who had no instruments would chant beautifully, which echoed throughout the village. Their special way of moving was a reminder of the simple rhythms of life. They didn't take big steps, but each foot was carefully placed in front of the other, with a pause in between. And during the pause, they would use the bells, gongs, flutes, or voices. This tradition went on for hundreds of years, but in the meantime, the village had grown into a huge city. A city where cars were driving and huge buildings and skyscrapers were erected. The rock plateau and the monastery, once standing out by itself in the center of the village, disappeared in between the jungle of buildings. There were very few monks left in the monastery, and the tradition that children would go to live there for 2 years had also faded away. Everybody in this modern life was too busy with other things to remember, and not being thankful to the life-giver for the gifts of life, to enjoy the simple rhythms of life and enjoy the silence. They were lost in the noises of life. Everybody constantly needed to have noise around them. People were getting into their cars, would immediately turn on their radios. Each house or living space had at least one or several radios and stereo TV sets and computers, and at least one was constantly switched on. Each individual had a Walkman or cell phone, and in the streets there was also lots of noises, for life was going on 24 hours a day. There were the noises of constructions and cars and people talking, screaming, airplanes flying over. There was constantly a lot of noise. People did not know how to live without noise anymore, because without having noise around them, they would feel lost, did not know what to do with themselves, and were afraid even of the silence. Although a lot of tradition had disappeared, once a month still some monks, for the nuns were also not longer there, would wander into the city. They were looked upon as strange characters to which nobody had any connection with. Most people were too busy with life and did not even notice them. Others, when they saw these monks walking in their slow pace in their strange traditional outfits, ringing their bells or gongs and chanting, turned away their faces, for they didn't know what to do with what they saw. It was a strange sight between all these modern buildings. Emerald, a computer programmer and developer, was busy like anybody else, always on the go and always had music and noise around him. For several years now Emerald was plagued with poor health and suffering from migraine headaches, had problems with his ears, and was a very nervous person, always stressed out and had a hard time falling asleep at night. He had visited doctors, clinics and therapists, had taken drugs and tried everything possibly according to him, but not much improvement had occurred. Although complaining on a daily basis, he had learned to live with these aches, pains and troubles. Then one day, hurrying out of the door of the office where he was working, he almost ran into a strange-looking character who was just passing by. However, it did not happen, for this character swiftly moved away, and then instead of bumping into him, Emerald stumbled and fell forward, but luckily did not hurt himself. A person reached out his hand to help him up, and as Emerald looked up, he looked into the eyes of a monk, and for a moment was overwhelmed by the look of those eyes and the peace surrounding this person. It was like he entered an ocean of calmness, an ocean of silence. After the monk had helped him up, the monk continued, footstep after footstep, his way. Emerald was very impressed with how the monk walked ever so peacefully, how he chanted and rang his bell, in a special rhythmic way, which brought a peace unfamiliar to him. He followed the monk for several blocks and noticed that the monk was not wearing any shoes. When there was glass or garbage on the pavement, the monk, without even looking at the ground, for his eyes were mostly closed, he would walk around the obstacles without hurting himself. Suddenly Emerald came to his senses again. "Oh wow," he said to himself, "I have to get going," and he rushed back to the street where his car was parked. As he got into his car and drove through the city, he noticed that he had not switched on the music in his car. This was the first time. But he was enjoying the sound of silence, even without being afraid of it. That evening at home, while working on his computer, his thoughts went back and forth to what had happened that day. And for the first time in many years, that night he felt sound asleep without any problems. The next day, as he was rushing for business through town, he kept on looking to see if he could see the monk. And this went on for several days. Something had inspired him, had changed some things, and he wanted to find out what it was. and the only way to find out, he thought, was by meeting the monk again. After days of hoping and looking, he became desperate. He could not find out where the monk had come from, and he went to the police station. The police told him that according to them, once a month, but they didn't know for sure, that one or several monks would walk through the streets. They seem to be calm and never do any harm. We never throw any of them in jail, although they look weird and strange. Do they not? When Emerald further asked if they knew where they came from, nobody seemed to have any idea. Back home, Emerald took his calendar, trying to calculate how long ago it had been that he saw the monk, and made note in his calendar to look out for the monk. However, 1 month later, Emerald had completely forgotten about the monk, as he was busy with life and had forgotten to look into his calendar. On that particular day, he was again rushing out of an office into the street to get a fast meal, ran around the corner, and tripped over somebody's feet. Again, luckily not hurting himself, he stood up, and to his surprise he saw the monk sitting cross-legged on the corner and eating his meal. With a hand gesture, the monk invited him to sit down and gave him a bowl to share some of his food. He gave Emerald some chopsticks so he would eat his meal slowly. Emerald observed the monk as he chewed his food very peacefully. In between, he caught the eyes of the monk and felt this incredible peace again. Strangely enough, when he was sitting there, enjoying the smell of this incredible food, he did not notice the street noises. After he finished his meal, he looked at his watch, thanked the monk, and stepped back into the rat race of life. However, before he could do that, the monk pressed a small envelope in his hand. He had no time to open it as he was running late for his next appointment. He went on the whole day, from client to client, rushing around, but he noticed again that it was different than his usual days. He did not feel so hyper or nervous anymore, but was full of energy, and he was more together, more accurate, and precise in his job. Even his boss praised him for that and gave him a pat on the shoulder. He thought about this and figured out that it must have had something to do with the food and the monk. So that evening, before going to bed, he went through his trousers and opened a small envelope, which contained a small piece of beautiful brownish paper with some flowers drawn on it, which was an invitation. The invitation said, "Come to visit me at the monastery at any time," and then there were some directions to get there. Emerald requested a day off and followed the instructions to the monastery. After he had taken the subway to an old part of the city, he walked following the directions on the invitation, in between the jungle of the first skyscrapers that had been built years ago before the new city center was erected. Then he saw the rock plateau with the monastery, which had aged but even more than the suburb. Seemingly it was not a place where anybody was going to, because it was surrounded by lots of railway tracks and had no bridges or paths to get there. So very carefully he had to cross many railroad tracks and found one of the pathways on the side of the rock plateau. As he walked up one of the small pathways, a peace entered his mind and heart. On top of the rock plateau there were small orchards, small herb and vegetable gardens, and here and there he saw some monks working. As he was enjoying the beauty of nature, he questioned himself, why would nobody ever come up here? But at the same time he found the answer. Most people had no time, or on the other hand, it was not easy to get to this place. He was now facing the walls of the monastery, which were almost completely covered by plants growing wildly and vines showing their different flowers. The walls of the monastery had small beautiful windows. More and more peace came to him as he walked around to find the main entrance. He saw the skyscrapers between the treetops and the trains passing by. He was amazed that no noise entered this place. It was really quiet here, and you could feel and hear the breeze of the wind. Emerald could hear the leaves being rustled by the wind, and the sounds of little animals and birds came to his ears. This was something he had never experienced before, and it felt great. Finally he found the main door. A monk came to meet him, and without talking, he gave the monk the invitation. After reading it, the monk made a gesture with his hand to follow him. They walked through huge hallways decorated with statues left and right, and he smelled incense throughout the hallways that looked out on a small monastery garden, which was the place to which the monk guided him. Emerald sat down on the bench, and the monk left. While inhaling the smell of the flowers, he looked around at the simplicity and beauty of the garden, and his heart felt warm. After a little while he saw a monk approaching. It was hard to recognize the monk he had seen in the city, for all of them were dressed the same, but as he came closer, Emerald saw the monk's eyes, the eyes of the monk he had met in the street. The monk spoke, "Welcome home, my friend." This had Emerald amazed, for in his mind he thought that nobody was allowed to speak here. And Emerald said, I didn't know that you were allowed to speak. And the monk replied, "Although we are called the keepers of the silence, in this garden we are allowed to speak. My name is Akio." "Why did you bring me here?" asked Emerald. And the monk replied, "I thought you would be curious to find out why, after 2 encounters, suddenly your life is changing a little here and there." "Yes, actually, I noticed a lot of changes." While speaking, Emerald was captured again by Akio's eyes, reflecting an incredible peace. "Let me first answer your first question. Emerald, you are here because you are on our list," said the monk. "Your list? What list?" said Emerald, amazed. "You are on our sacred list of people who we need to pick up, and who have to get familiar with the silence," replied the monk. "But where does this list come from?" "This list," answered Akio, "was brought by the first monk who came to this monastery from a very far away place. It is hundreds of years old." "But when it is hundreds of years old, how can I be possibly on the list?" replied Emerald. "It is so old I was not even born." "Everything is planned and organized in life's magical adventure," spoke the monk. "Tomorrow is Tuesday, is it not? Tuesday, November the 27th. Is it not true that hundreds of years ago they could have figured out that today would be the 27th? Everything is already written." Being confused, Emerald was ready to ask more questions, but before he could, the monk held up his hand and said, "Do not worry too much about these things. The more you understand about silence, the clearer these things will become." While the monk was speaking, a beautiful bird landed on his shoulders, and it was as if the bird whispered something in his ear. The bird flew away, and Akio said, "It is time for lunch. Follow me, but be aware that we can only speak here outside." They walked for a while and then entered the big room where a table that almost took the entire space was standing. Seated at the table were many monks, who had now removed their straw hats, allowing Emerald a better look at their faces and eyes. They had been waiting for Emerald and Akio to join them, so the meal could start. When Emerald had taken his place, he took up his chopsticks and moved his bowl closer to him and was ready to start eating. But before he did, he glanced around and saw that all the monks had closed their eyes, and Emerald followed their example. After an incredible simple and healthy meal, Akio and Emerald went back into the garden to continue their conversation. "Are you willing to learn more about the silence?" spoke the monk. "Yes," said Emerald. "It really fascinates me, but I cannot come to live here at the monastery. I have a job and obligations." Akio took over and said, "I'm very aware that you have your work, and it is very important that you continue doing this work. But we can also help you to start living a different life, while being amongst the noise and speed and stresses of life." "I really would like that," said Emerald. "I knew you would say that," said the monk. "And I have taken the freedom this morning to send a fax in your name asking for a leave of absence for 2 months. Your boss replied that it was no problem." Do you mean my boss agreed?" asked Emerald, amazed. "There was no problem," Akio repeated. "And you have fax machines here at the monastery?" "Yes," spoke the monk. "We have some modern equipment and devices, but we only use them to make our life easier. So we have more time available to tend our gardens and to keep the silence. We are not the slaves of these machines, as man has become in the city, for his life is ruled by money, machines, cars, and the noise." Emerald's thoughts drifted off, for he was overwhelmed that he was facing a 2-month vacation, something he had not had since he started working. "Later, Emerald, you will be taken to your room. There you will find everything you need, including clothing, like the other monks wear. Learn to enjoy the silence while you're here, and when you're not out of your room, practice to follow the footsteps of the other monks. Do everything at their pace, and do not try to go faster than them. In your room you will also find some bells and gongs, and you will learn how to chant." Emerald interrupted the monk and said, "You are called the keepers of silence, but you make noise with bells and gongs, and you sing and chant." The monk replied, "In order to enter the real silence, the sounds of the outer world and in our mind need to be replaced by more peaceful sounds at first. And then hopefully in the future you will start entering the inner silence between the noises. In our training we combine slow walking, replacing sounds with sounds, and in between the moments of the noise, finding the real silence. The noises from outside always draw our attention outward, and the noise of our mind, our wishes and dreams and fantasies and thoughts always push us to do things. For that reason, we never find the real silence. So it is by this method of using simple sounds and using the moments in between to get in contact with that inner silence. And once you enter that inner silence, you will discover a new world." It was difficult but manageable for Emerald. He walked, chanted, and ate with the monks, and Akio was always there to assist or guide him whenever he needed. After the 3rd week he was told to follow Akio into the city, following his pace and footsteps. He discovered a complete new way of looking at things, of life, and was content and happy. Every day he progressed. He worked hard at keeping life simple. It was not easy, as he was used to going so fast, eating food fast, racing through the day, and not noticing these magical gifts of life. His migraine headaches had completely disappeared. His hearing had returned and was no longer full of nervousness, and he slept peacefully on a daily basis. After the 2 months, Emerald had turned into a complete different person, a person that radiated peace and tranquility, and after his final conversation with Akio in the garden, Emerald had to go back into his old life. But Akio assured him whenever he needed to come to the monastery for a little while, he was most welcome to do so. Emerald went back to his world, but was now seeing life in a complete different way. He started to enjoy life, doing an excellent job at his work, but was not caught up into the speed anymore, the stress and the noises of life. He became better and better at his job, a better friend to everybody, and it was not that he never listened to the radio or never looked at the TV anymore, but now he had become the master of the modern devices. His home became after a while like a little monastery itself. Many times when his friends would ask him what had happened to him, he would reply that the secret was not to be revealed, but when it is meant to be for you, it will happen, was his answer, for he had promised Akio not to say more than that. Emerald lived many beautiful years, and after he retired, he went to live in the monastery, about which he and Akito had spoken many times over the years. Emerald had been permitted to become a part of the permanent monks in the monastery. And just the same as Akio, Emerald's eyes also became that same peaceful ocean. He was made familiar with the sacred list, and he too was given names of people he had to pick up in the city, who were to be guided to the sacred monastery of silence. For many years he lived at the monastery and was in constant contact with the inner silence, and followed in the tradition of the monks called the Keepers of the Silence, in the footsteps of his master Akio, who had passed on. What the story could bring us. Most people are looking for peace and quietness, not only in this hectic, stressful world, but also in the stress and hectic within our own mind. Peace and quietness we may not find in the external world, and to find this real peace and silence, we might have to go inside ourselves, where everlasting peace can be found. It is said, when the pupil is ready, the master will appear.